Well, look, there's obviously a host of complex issues that have to deal with the fallout of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In first respect, this is a crisis resultant from the ongoing process of the Soviet Union dissolving and of a Russian fight to retain influence over the strategic orientation of certain states that it considers to be part of its geopolitical space, like Ukraine, like Belarus. So these are conflicts of Soviet succession. Another aspect of this is the fact that after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, a security vacuum in Europe was filled by the United States, by European states who expanded NATO's security architecture. And they built a framework, a security framework in Europe that Russia doesn't feel it has a stake in, right? That is, from the Russian perspective, security outcomes in Europe are principally determined by the United States and European states. And Russia historically had been a power with strong influence on security outcomes in Europe and wants to have that voice. That's very clear. And so it is very revisionist in terms of the position that Russian elites feel Russia has ended up in after the end of the Cold War. And then there's another aspect of this, right, which is a conflict of systems, right? Russian political and economic system is fundamentally one that is authoritarian. It's closer to a personalized authoritarian system, but also heavily driven by patronage networks, by rent seeking and the like. And the European Union is an expansionist entity from the standpoint of it's a legal system, it's a way of doing business, a framework that's mutually exclusive with that of Russia. And the European Union is magnetic, it's attractive. I mean, the European Union generally is not expanding in a strategic sense. That is, Europeans seek to just expand the European Union with a clear strategy or vision. But it cannot help the fact that it is very attractive from an economic, political standpoint. And one of the problems the Russian state has is Russia is not attractive as a political or economic model of development, right? So what you're seeing naturally is both a fragmentation to some extent of Russian influence in the former Soviet space and over countries it really cares about, like Ukraine. You see a continued argument and disagreement over how security outcomes are to be determined in Europe and Russia unhappy with its position and role. You see the maintenance of a Russian strategy of extended defense, that's the belief of the Russian security establishment that Russia's real outer borders are not its national borders. They're at the outer edges of the borders of Ukraine and Belarus, and that these are buffer states, right? And buffer states are never neutral. Buffer states are one country's buffer against somebody else. So you're in an endless bid for relative influence to try to maintain control over the strategic orientation of that state. And that's an important factor over the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and a confrontation that emerged resulting from that post 2014 between Russia and the United States and many Western allies and partners. So this part makes sense, right? So you have a host of, you have Ukraine kind of at the intersection of a number of Venn diagrams in terms of strategic drivers of Russian behavior, elite preferences, processes that are still unfolding, like the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That, folks think that the Soviet Union collapsed as an event in 1991, but it didn't. And a tremendous sort of, I think empire is not the correct term, but is often used to describe the Soviet Union. A country of that size, a multi-ethnic country of that size, cannot be dissolved in one day by a meeting between three men. It's just not a realistic reading of history. So we're still seeing sort of a second generation of wars of Soviet succession unfold. And that's part of the reason why the region is very unstable. Well, Ukraine and Belarus evolved very differently as independent states after 1991. Belarus had established a fairly classic authoritarian regime under Lukashenko. In some aspects, it was like the Soviet Union had kept going and never ended in terms of state and economic policies. And it pursued loosely a common state union with Russia. So at first, it almost seemed like the regime in Belarus was the one country that wasn't sure what to do with its own independence. And For a long time, Lukashenko played a very lucrative two-level game. He would basically engage in rent-seeking, and he tried to get as much as he could out of Russia in terms of subsidies and economic benefits. And when he could, he turned to Europeans and tried to get benefits from Europeans and play one side against each other, try to benefit in the middle. That all ended, of course, with the unraveling of the regime resulting from the stolen election over a year ago and all the protests. And so the massive crackdown and repression of that regime basically ended the other half, that is the counterparty to this game on the Western side, and it gave them no option but to become firmly ensconced within a Russian sphere of influence and become fully dependent on Russia from a security and economic standpoint, right? And to be clear, probably from a Russian perspective, the one country they care about more than Ukraine is Belarus, and it's important from them, both from a standpoint of looking at it as a geopolitical space, from a standpoint of security considerations, and a whole host of elite outlooks as well. So you can see a very different trajectory in the development of Belarus and Ukraine. You also see a very strong degree of learning on the Russian part, resulting from the war they had with Ukraine in trying to engage in better ordering of the space they are trying to claim, right? That is not having a heavy-handed military response in Belarus, but instead helping Lukashenko, backstopping him so he can conduct a crackdown, but then very slowly creeping and dramatically expanding Russian influence and Russian military presence in Belarus and the like. Yes, and the Russian goal in Belarus is to manage a transition, to find a way to have the regime survive a transition from Lukashenko personally, because it is such a personalized regime, it's tied to the individual, and find a way to get him to leave. Of course, he doesn't want to leave, and that's now most dictators don't want to leave. That's kind of the nature of the beast. Especially in personalized authoritarian regimes, they have a very hard time leaving because they're very worried that as soon as they leave, the next person that comes to power is going to take all the things that they stole, potentially indict and imprison their family, and lustrate them, and all sorts of things will happen for them. So they have a very hard time leaving. Leaving is a big challenge if you're a dictator, at least leaving peacefully. So I think you can see a strong evolution in the Russian approach after what happened in Ukraine to managing the crisis in Belarus, which is still evolving. But if you're looking at these two areas, the two likely potential conflicts in Europe, that is the potential for real war in Europe, are over Belarus, the crisis right now, with Belarus attempting to essentially import migrants from the Middle East and then pushing them across the Polish border to destabilize Poland, and the situation surrounding Ukraine, which is also another potential flashpoint. That is a very strong possibility that there might be a second Russia-Ukraine war on a much larger scale in the coming future. So in early 2014 in February, two things happened at the same time. Russian forces deployed, seized Crimea, and then annexed it within a month, while simultaneously Russian intelligence, backed by semi-state actors, or let's say very empowered individuals affiliated with the state, attempted to create a counter-Maidan in eastern regions of Ukraine. And not just eastern, they also attempted to do it in Kharkiv and Odessa and other cities, but that part failed. And when that effort in the first couple of weeks was not successful, it led to an escalation, essentially a state-sponsored insurgency, and then an introduction of direct military capabilities from Russia. And that eventually evolved into an overt, very conventional military intervention by Russian forces in August and September of 2014, which led to the first series of direct battles, and then a second series in January and February of 2015. Since then, it's been a simmering conflict and it's died down, but what essentially you have is half of the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk are occupied and are these sort of gray zones because they are self-declared states that are entirely backed and supported by Russia. Russia, in most political and economic senses, has annexed that region because it lives entirely dependent on Russian support. A lot of people have left it. The population there, I can't remember, maybe was 3.5 million or so, but Russia's taken hundreds and thousands of individuals from Ukraine and is increasingly giving some of them citizenship. And the sort of separatist forces of these self-declared Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics are largely subsistent and dependent on Russia and the Russian military. So it's been a simmering conflict since then, but the level of fighting casualty has generally died down in the last 2-3 years. It's been fairly low compared to the actual periods of conventional fighting. So these are both international disputes. These are both conflict areas, but Crimea was annexed almost completely bloodlessly, and is now going to be the case of one of the more long-running international territorial disputes. Russia has annexed it. Nobody has recognized Russian annexation of Crimea. Ukraine has no legal, political, or military means of getting it back. And this is not an uncommon situation in international politics. One state takes territory that they claims belongs to them, and they have the power to keep it, and that is how things are going to be. But Eastern Ukraine is very much an unsettled equation, and it's clear that the Russian leadership's plan was politically to force kind of a reinsertion of these regions back into Ukraine as special autonomous zones, and to use that as a grappling hook and anchor to have a clear say over Ukraine's strategic orientation, and also to use them to make sure that a Western project in Ukraine would not be successful. It would be very difficult for Ukraine with this ongoing conflict and its various implications to either enter NATO or to even be successful in further integrating itself into Western economic political structures, right? I think to some extent that Russian strategy had good prospects, not in the near term, but in the medium and long term. Naturally, Ukraine's not going anywhere. They're tethered to each other on the border. And that is one aspect of the tyranny of geography, right? Countries can't choose who their neighbors are going to be. Countries like the United States, whose only neighbors really are Mexico, Canada, well, maybe Russia across the Bering Strait, but are largely surrounded by two oceans. And the United States can choose where it's going to go. And most of the wars that it's going to fight are wars of choice. But countries in Europe or in Asia cannot choose who their neighbors are going to be. They have no options. They have to live with the powers they have next door. So, with that in mind, I think Russians believe that in the medium term they'll almost be successful. Ukraine would return to a multi-vector policy, and that the West will get tired of dealing with Ukraine. It would develop fatigue. But to some extent, that policy is on the ground, and I think the signaling this year for Russian political leadership has been that they don't believe the Minsk process is going anywhere, that the ceasefire doesn't any longer really serve the political purpose they envision, and they're increasingly unhappy with Ukraine's growing integration, defense cooperation with the United States and UK. The Ukraine may not be formally joining NATO, but it's kind of being used and treated as a de facto ally. And from the Russian point of view, if functionally there's no difference, then there's no difference for them in terms of red lines. And there are two visible Russian red lines that I think are really coming to the fore as catalyst of a potential renewed war. The first is a de facto abrogation of any political negotiations over the Minsk ceasefire agreement and implementation of the Minsk agreement. And the Normandy discussion process is now relatively stillborn, and it's not clear that Ukrainian political leadership has any intention of returning to negotiations. Not that Russia is delivering much of anything on its end. And the second one is this growing integration and cooperation between Ukraine and countries like the United States and UK. And from the Russian point of view, I think both of these are red lines, and they're increasingly building a case to themselves and signaling that they see a real utility to use force to change this current status quo and to perhaps impose an entirely new political agreement on Ukraine. Probably a much worse one, because it'll be a much larger scale conflict. I mean, I don't think it has any relationship to a potential conflict. Conflicts have political causes, and this is not one of them. But it is a very important sort of, not symptom, but very clear lagging indicator of what Nikolai Patrushev said, because what he said is true. There is no relationship between Russia and NATO. First, from the Russian point of view, NATO is always a conversation about the United States and about US ability to project power in Europe. and NATO being an enabling alliance for US ability to determine security outcomes in Europe. And it was never really a conversation of like a relationship between Russia and NATO as an alliance in of itself, because the Russian preference is to deal with other powers, especially on an individual basis, not to deal with collective security or economic blocs. The second part of it is that, look, let's be very frank, the NATO-Russia relationship was not a particularly meaningful consolation prize resulting from the NATO-Russia Founding Act, right, of 1997, which was essentially given to Russia to help it politically swallow NATO enlargement because Moscow couldn't do anything about it anyway, right? But this was an incredibly unrealistic bid, it always had been, to attempt to build some kind of cooperative security framework or relationship that would keep Russia in terms of being a stakeholder in security in Europe while engaging in NATO enlargement and while essentially, I think very logically, securing for the United States a decisive role in shaping European security, which is a critical aspect of our grand strategy and always had been, right? So on the one hand, you can't blame us for doing what we did. On the other hand, when you look back at that history, you have to see how unrealistic it was to assume that the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which committed and gave Russia very little of anything. I mean, it basically gave it a small seat at the table to listen to what was going on and the ability to engage in some political interactions with NATO. But on the whole, I don't think it was very meaningful. And the United States and I think we ourselves, we've demonstrated clearly how meaningless this was, because the first thing we did when Russia invaded Ukraine was to suspend interactions, right, between NATO and Russia, and to use this as a clear way to voice our displeasure rather than saying, you know, it's a very important and meaningful mechanism, and we really need to maintain strategic stability, and we really need to deconflict things and avoid escalation. The first thing people said is, we can't do business as usual. If this is how Russia is going to behave, then we should not have any of these mechanisms, right? So it wasn't just meaningless to them, it was also pretty meaningless to us. And I'm actually happy that we're now all admitting to each other what this really was and how largely irrelevant it was to our interests and our political relationship. And I think the Russian preference is to deal directly with the United States on issues of strategic stability, and then to deal separately with major European nations and to not have interactions with NATO, right? And I think both sides look at these agreements as vestiges of a relationship, a political and security relationship that we had in the 1990s that doesn't hold because the context for that relationship is entirely gone. The geopolitical context for it is gone. We are in an outright confrontation that have been for quite a few years. We don't agree in terms of interests. We don't agree in terms of outlooks. We don't have the same vision for security in Europe. I think that what's been happening is the Russian military all year has been preparing for a potential contingency with Ukraine, and has likely been ordered to slowly position itself to be prepared to conduct a military operation if that decision is made by the political leadership in the coming months. The military activity is very unusual. It's very out of cycle. It's being done secretively. There are no coercive or political statements associated with it, which is very strange and very different compared to what happened in March and April. And it should be viewed in the context of a year-long change in Russian political discourse on Ukraine. So I think that it is very likely the Russian leadership is considering or debating internally a renewed conflict, a renewed war on a larger scale with Ukraine to try to achieve their political objectives. And probably they haven't made up their mind, but the Russian military certainly appears to be positioning itself to affect this kind of operation. Now, not in the coming days or weeks. It doesn't look that way, but it's slowly putting pieces in place, and it's hanging around Ukraine without any reasonable explanation for what this military activity and forward deployments could be. So this is likely something that could happen next year, perhaps during wintertime, in the coming months. It's a very worrisome development, and I think it's an area or space that people really should watch and continue watching over the coming holidays as we get into the winter. Well, first I'll say that leaders do matter because they have ideas and they have particular outlooks on the world. But it would be very wrong to boil down international politics and foreign policy to leaders. They are subject to domestic political constraints. They are subject to a selectorate, groups of elites around them and their views. They are the products of a strategic culture. Leaders don't come from another planet. They are born and raised within the strategic culture of an environment. If you become a leader in Mexico, it's probably because you grew up amongst the elites of Mexico and you went through sort of the circles of power. And you're going to be the intellectual product of those circles. You might have ideas slightly different from another leader, but they're not going to be dramatically different actually from that elite community. And if they were, you wouldn't be very effective implementing your policy because your own elites would oppose you and they would try to sabotage your attempts to implement those politics. So it's very important we don't just focus on Putin and we look at the other elites in the regime. We look at the ideas within it. And also we look at the enduring drivers or preferences in Russian foreign policy, because whether democratic or an authoritarian states have interests, the elites have preferences, and there are real material drivers of their behavior, along with some of the ideational ones. I think what we're seeing around Ukraine, sure, some of it ties to some of Putin's personal outlooks and preferences, but it's very much not just about him. As I like to say, Russia's not a very large country with a population of one man, Vladimir Putin. And it's not a case of we just have to figure out what he thinks to answer some of these questions. When we look at some of the other linkages you tried to make, or at least the dots you put on the board, I don't see any problem with Putin's political approval of domestic ratings. I actually don't see much of that as a relationship to foreign policy. Regimes like Russia's deal with domestic political problems either through repression at home, either through provision of subsidies and co-optation, and through forms of economic policy, or via internal security forces, right? There is a strain of thinking, obviously, in study in political science that looks at diversionary war theory and the possibility that leaders will conduct diversionary wars to try to save or resurrect themselves in domestic politics. And I think most of it is junk, and I don't subscribe to it, and I don't see any pattern of behavior. I think nothing is bad at predicting state behavior than diversionary or distractionary war theory. Because if I showed you Russian foreign policy over the last 30 years, and I showed you all the times that Russia had economic troubles or there were problems in terms of political stability or approval, you won't find conflicts and wars, right? It's very unpredictable. And so these ideas usually posit outcomes of foreign policy when it is successful as the cause. That is, if a leader does something militarily and happens to be successful, they then say that the purpose of that action was to achieve domestic political success, which is complete nonsense and not empirical. So I just don't subscribe to it. I don't think anything that's happening today has anything to do with the internal domestic political problems or pressures of Russia. In fact, they actually aren't there. The regime is very stable. Protests have died down. In terms of economic and political policy, I think the system is doing actually quite fine. Well, let's say not fine, but from a perspective of regime stability, there isn't any obvious overt threat or problem they have to suddenly solve. And if they did, they certainly wouldn't solve it by embarking in a military adventure, which would then lead to sanctions and pressure, which would actually destabilize the regime. It doesn't make any sense at all intellectually to even think that way. Your last point on transition, it's a complex topic. I'll try to answer it briefly by simply saying that regime transition has been a historical problem in Russia throughout the history of the Russian Empire, and even during some of the history of the Soviet Union, which was a more stable period in time in terms of regime transition. So, as I described earlier, there is a real challenge. If you're an autocrat in a personalized authoritarian regime, how to transition power. It's very hard to get out. It's very hard to pick someone that you know will secure and look after you once you leave. And it's very hard to orchestrate a transition Because once you make your preferences known, the elite groups, the patriot networks who will be opposed, who feel themselves as losers, will try to sabotage your plans. So it's not very easy to make that clear. And I think the catch-22 of Putin's approach is that he has to make it look like he is staying forever in order to actually orchestrate his own transition and to pick or select a successor, right? As soon as he says that I'm leaving and here's when I think I'm leaving, then very quickly amongst the elites, the question quickly arises, why should anyone listen to Putin anymore, right? And they will begin fighting amongst themselves to try to determine the outcome. And that's why I do subscribe to Tim Fry's overall theory that Putin is a weak strongman, and that his power is derived from arbitration and position and aspects of Russian politics and relationships between the elites. But he's not a very strong autocrat in the sense that you might picture some others, particularly leaders historically in Latin America as well. So this, I think, it's important to have a more nuanced view of Russian politics and to understand the limitations and constraints on a leader like Putin's ability to exercise power to shape politics. He has to bring sizable numbers of the elites along, right? And they do a lot of internal polling for policy, and they make sure that there is some general constellation of significant public support. They are very careful. They've not run the system this long without paying strong attention and without being cautious in their approach. So it's a regime that at least tries to be informed about both consequences on foreign policy and domestic politics.